Hi class, welcome to lecture 4. Today we're going to be talking all about different types of political violence. So let's first define what politically motivated violence is. We're going to first say it's outside of state control. We do talk about terrorism in this lecture, and there is state-sponsored terrorism, but we're going to focus less on that and focus more on actions carried out by non-state actors, including different types of contentious politics. Maybe that's an understatement. Contentious, perhaps doesn't describe a civil war or revolution or violent riots and strikes, but we would categorize all these types of movements, wars, whatever we want to call them, as types of politically motivated violence. So when we're getting behind the reasoning for why we experience political violence, and we're talking about this on a broader scale in many different countries, right? Whether it's a Syrian civil war or going back in history, the U.S. Civil War, or riots we've seen in the last couple of years. In Australia right now, they're having massive riots against the government with the increased shutdown. So I think the natural progression in this topic is to ask, why does violence happen sometimes? What are the explanations for why something becomes so contentious that it leads to violence, and why in other times is that not the case? So we're going to try to explore that with 3 explanations: institutional, ideational, and individual. Again, these are reasons for why violence occurs in some instances, but perhaps in not others. So starting with the institutional answer for why political violence sometimes occurs is just that. Institutional problems lead to marginalized populations, a chunk, maybe a small or even a large chunk of the population that feels excluded by their government or marginalized by their government, right? Some governments are perhaps better at this, reducing violence by promoting inclusion, by making sure that everyone feels represented and included in the country's benefits. Others are not so good at that. What might some examples of this be? Well, let's look at the United States of America as an example, perhaps. And this happens, in many countries, but let's focus on the U.S. We do have winner-take-all elections, normally meaning that 1 or 2 parties will win the election. As a result of that, I think we do get some groups that feel marginalized and perhaps or underrepresented, I should say. We know that people of color and women tend to be hugely underrepresented in American politics, and we've also seen an increase in polarization. And as of late, everything going on with COVID and other political and racial tensions have led to some violence and certainly a lot of conflict. So under conditions like this, sometimes we see these marginalized groups see political violence as a logical reaction because they feel, or even in reality, sometimes their forms of, or their ability, I should say, to politically participate are sometimes blocked. And that's really what makes them marginalized. So sometimes it can be seen as a logical reaction to existing or thought to exist marginalization. And again, that's kind of what a lot of the conflict's been about recently in this country. So I think that's a perfect example. The second reason for why political violence sometimes occur, ideational reasoning, essentially that certain ideas set a worldview, diagnose issues, provide resolution, and describe a means to achieving goals. Any of these things I mentioned in the previous sentence that you see listed up here can inspire people to violence. So, ideas are almost always going to be, I'm going to go back to this slide, ideas, strong worldviews, strong ways and thoughts that you think the government should run can lead people to take what we might see as extreme violent action. And it's very interesting because oftentimes this is wrapped up in religious fundamentalism, which we will talk about at the end of this lecture. But I don't want us to make this mistake that this type of violence is fundamentalism is always wrapped up in religion. I would say it's strong ideas. Strong ideas lead to situations where people are willing to get violent. So is that often wrapped up in religion? Of course it is, because religion creates very strong ideals and ideas, but oftentimes it's wrapped up in other things, right? It could be a sense of nationalism. It could be a sense of, again, feeling like you don't belong, or feeling marginalized. So we see violence associated with strong ideas all the time. I mean, if you look at communist countries, we've spoken a little bit about communism, you'll see oftentimes a lot of death and destruction in countries like that. And that's a very strong utopian type idea. So I think it's ideas that lead to political violence rather than always religion. And keep that in mind as we go on. So I think a good example of this is the Arab Spring Revolution in Egypt. The state was seen as perhaps not being strong enough, lacking legitimacy, especially in the face of an extremely strong military. And what you'd eventually see is the military take over the country, and they're still controlling the country today. So what kind of started out as a push for democracy ended with a military takeover of the country. But again, strong ideas often inspire political violence. That's the crux of what we're getting at here. And finally, the third reason for perhaps why we see political violence in certain times is the individual reasoning. And there's two aspects to this: psychological and rational. Psychological meaning individual experiences can often drive people to violence. And the rational side of it is violence is often a strategy to achieve goals. So let's separate these two because they're extraordinarily different, right? Psychological, these are instances when we see one or maybe a couple individuals who've had certain experiences that lead them to political violence. And it's not always the political issue itself that pushes them to violence. It's oftentimes their experiences that have perhaps left them desperate for something to make themselves feel a part of something, or to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And that can lead them to join some sort of movement, whether it be on their own or some kind of extremist organization. And let me give you an example of that. A broad example of that is normally those who are involved in terrorist organizations, they're almost always young men, almost always, right? I think perhaps, I'm of course not a psychologist or psychiatrist, so, bear with me here, but I think it's because they're in that time for both men and women. It's a very difficult time, right? Being a high schooler, being 16, 17, 18 is a hard time in your life. You're going through changes, you're being exposed to new ideas. Kids can be very cruel. So sometimes people feel dejected or left out. Maybe they're not very personal. Maybe their social skills haven't developed yet. And this discourages them from participating in normal walks of life. They find a group that finally accepts them. Maybe it's an extremist group, maybe something they wouldn't necessarily have been drawn to had they not had these past experiences, these harmful experiences. And then next thing you know, they're all in on that topic because they find a sense of belonging. So, that's often why gangs, terrorist organizations target young men. I mean, even the military, right, targets young men because our brains haven't fully developed yet. So we're kind of more susceptible to outside influence. All right. So just one thing to think about. And again, these are just sort of theories as to why political violence happens, right? And then let's look at the other aspect, the rational side of it. Violence is a strategy to achieve goals. So very different than psychological, and this is somewhat controversial, but we talked about it a little bit earlier. At what point of marginalization does violence become the only answer to the problem, right? Some people feel like they've pursued legal recourse, they've pursued social recourse, and they're not moving the needle the way that they need to be. So they say, okay, if they're going to keep marginalizing our group of people, and this could relate to really any country, at what point is violence the only answer, especially when violence is being committed against you by another group or even by the state, right? So, perhaps the best example of this, again, we're talking a lot about the US, but I think it kind of drives some of the points. If we look at the civil rights movement in the United States, right, the leading figure would be Dr. Martin Luther King. And the part of the reason Dr. King is such an amazing human, an inspirational human being, was because he worked with non-violent strategies, right? Which is absolutely incredible, especially considering what those people were going through. I mean, to be non-violent when someone's screaming in your face, spitting at you, hitting you, the police are hitting you with fire hoses and releasing dogs and beating you, to respond with non-violence is absolutely incredible. I couldn't do it. I'm sure a lot of you couldn't do it either. If someone's spitting in your face, I'm probably going to try to punch him, right? And I think most people would do that. But part of the reason Dr. King is such an amazing man was because he was able to convince people that non-violence was the only way, and it worked, right? Obviously, the journey's not over, but it worked. And on the other hand, you have someone kind of like Malcolm X who was saying, we have to answer violence with violence. We've tried non-violence. We've tried the legal system. We've tried the social path. We need to respond with violence, right? So, we might say it can be rational to certain groups in certain times in history. So let's look at different types of political violence, starting with revolution. We're going to kind of define and differentiate different types of political violence we see. Revolution is a public seizure of the state in order to overturn the existing government or regime. So the people taking over the government because of some perceived or real injustice or problem. So the public is the crucial aspect of any revolution, right? I mean, if you're going to overthrow the government, you're going to need the hearts and minds of most individuals, at least I would say a majority of individuals, to really put pressure on the government, to really have the force to take over a government. And when you look at violence, things like coups and other types of violence, they're usually centered around the elites. Military takeovers, a coup d'etat, or even powerful groups pushing a president out or a leader out. They're usually centered around the wealthy members of society. Revolution is different in that you need the general support of people or it'll never work. So in any revolution, the goal is to gain control of the state. Usually 9 times out of 10, a revolution is going to be violent because the state's not just going to willingly give up power without a fight. That'd be very rare to see something like that. So let's differentiate what a revolution is between something called a coup d'etat, or a coup as it's commonly known as. A revolution is different than a coup in that, as I mentioned before, in a coup, usually it's the elites removing a regime and replacing it with a new one. Right, a good example of that would be the Russian Revolution, 1917, Chile in 73, Iran, Soviet Union, etc. It's also different than a negotiated transition, which is very rare. I think the best example of that is in South Africa in '94. So you had the apartheid government who negotiates a transition. They saw the writing on the wall. They knew their days were limited. So they negotiate a transition to the new regime of government. Okay, so very rare that happens, but South Africa was getting a lot of internal and external pressure to change their system. They're giving heavily sanctioned by other countries, and this is how they chose to transition to power. Also, it's very different from a secessionist movement. Secession is when one group seeks independence from another group. Right. So one example of a secessionist movement would be the Civil War, right? You have the southern states trying to withdraw from the Union. Of course, the Union rejected that secession and won the Civil War, and they remained in the Union. Another example would be Pakistan's separation from India, South Sudan's separation from Sudan. That might be the most recent example. So we've talked about so far revolutions, coups, negotiated transitions, and secessionist movements. So be sure that you know the details and why these four terms are different. Okay, so sticking with the theme of revolution, we talked about different types of violence. We talked about when political violence arises. What causes a revolution? What are some of the causes of revolutions? Because there can be many different causes. Let's start with the relative deprivation model. This is the theory that a period of rapid economic growth will create unattainable expectations and standards that, when they are failed to be met, can trigger resentment, right? So you see this happen a lot in what we call rentier states. That is countries where the government pays their citizens. So in some countries, they'll give each citizen a stipend, usually when they have a large natural resource like oil, right? They'll divvy some of that out to their people. So what ends up happening sometimes in countries that do things like that is, let's say oil takes the price per barrel takes a dive off a cliff. Now the government is substantially less wealthy. There's a lot less money coming in. So they can't give the people as much money or goods or services, whatever it might be, as they previously were doing. So people get used to the standard of life, and then it kind of, again, falls off a cliff. They're more likely to rebel against the government, maybe start a revolution. Now, I'm going to include, for every possible reason for a revolution, a criticism. And I think the criticism here, the best criticism, is poor predictability, right? How do you determine at what level of goods that people are receiving to losing they will rebel? And there's been plenty of instances where economies have turned very poor in a country and the people haven't rebelled or started a revolution. So it's very difficult to tell, but that is one potential reason for why revolutions start. The second possible cause for revolutions is the institutions reasoning. And this is the idea that international and even domestic political competition can create opening for dissent, right? So let's say in a country you have a lot of different factions vying for power, or your country is constantly in war, whether it be economic or physical or military, or competition with other countries. It creates room for dissent, one, because it depletes resources, and two, it's simply exhausting, right? Factions competing for power, rich factions, while the people kind of suffer through either regime. Possible examples: France in 1789, the fall of the USSR in 1989. So it is possible that internal and external competition can create these issues for people. If we had to criticize this theory, I'd say it definitely neglects the role of the population, individuals, and ideas that people surround themselves. So we talked about the ideational reasoning beforehand. But I think oftentimes, and again, in revolution, you need the population behind you. And in this explanation for revolutions, doesn't necessarily take that into account. Okay, so we talked about revolutions, we talked about coups, we talked about all these other types of political violence. Now I want to talk about the most complicated and controversial type of political violence, that is terrorism. Now, like many definitions in political science, terrorism has 100 different definitions. But for the purpose of this class, we're going to define it as use of violence and intimidation by non-state actors against civilians in order to achieve a political goal. So the use of violence against essentially civilians in order to achieve a political goal. So there's three parts to this definition that I really want you to understand. In order for something to be classified as terrorism, according to the definition we're going to use, and we're going to use this all semester, one, there has to be some sort of violence, right? Or intimidation, which we're going to count as violence. Two, they must be non-state actors targeting civilians. Okay, so it's not again, there is state-sponsored terrorism, but we'll get into that later. 2, it has to be a non-state actor, and it has to be targeting not government military officials, but civilians. And 3, they must be doing it to achieve a political goal. There must be some kind of end game political thing they're working towards, not just a random act of terror or of murder. So I said carried out by state actors. And again, state-sponsored terrorism is a thing usually carried out by proxies, meaning they'll hire it out. But we're more focusing on non-state actors for this lecture. And we talked about targeting civilians and political intent, so let's keep going. Do not get confused. Again, terrorism is not a random act of violence. If person A goes into the streets having a bad day, gets in a car accident, and shoots person B and kills them, that's not terrorism, right? That doesn't meet the criteria we just established. They're not trying to, let me go back to that definition. They're not trying to intimidate or use violence against the civilian to achieve the political goal. I mean, they are a citizen, they are committing violence, but there's no political goal there. They're just pissed off. Okay, so that wouldn't be classified as terrorism. Also, we're going to rule out non-state actors targeting the state. We would define that as guerrilla war. Okay, so it has to be committed for sake of this lecture against the civilian. So here's a very interesting chart. I believe this is in your textbook. You can see, to clarify the definition, if we go state, that would be considered a war, right? And these are actors and targets, okay? So if it's a non-state actor and the target is the state, it'd be guerrilla war. If it's a state actor and the target is civilian, it'd be state-sponsored terror, human rights violations. And if it's a non-state actor targeting civilians, it'd be terrorism. Okay, so this chart is an excellent way to kind of differentiate between different types of violence. So another interesting thing in this chart is a little outdated. I need to replace the chart, and I will soon. I just couldn't find a better one in my limited search. We've seen the number of deaths in the entire world from terrorism somewhat rise and continue to rise over recent periods of time. So it's interesting to think, why is that happening? Why does that keep happening? Why is the number of terrorist attacks going up and up and up? And that's something I want you to keep in mind as we're doing this lecture, and maybe we could try to pinpoint that exact reasoning. So that's going to do it for lecture 4, part A. I will have part B posted as soon as I'm done recording.